you very much indeed, Mr. Holman. As ever, it is a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I'd also like to thank the Minister for being here. I wish her luck in any coming reshuffle, and I'd like to thank also colleagues, honourable members from Yorkshire, from Devon, from Cornwall, and indeed other parts of the United Kingdom. Indeed, two members from Cornwall, and it's Yorkshire, and it's a delight to see them both. So I saw one quite recently. I saw one quite recently on the Isle of Wight. Sadly, not both, but this debate was originally granted prior to the COVID pandemic, and clearly much has changed since then. But I also wonder, actually, if the fundamentals in relation to unavoidably small hospitals have changed. And I still fear, and the reason why I called the debate back then, and indeed wanted the debate now, is because I fear that they are still the poorer cousins of larger district general hospitals. And in my speech, I'd like to make 2 points. I'm going to talk specifically about St Mary's on the Island, clearly, because it's my own constituency. But I think there are broader points to be made about unavoidably small hospitals throughout the United Kingdom. And specifically, I'd like to ask the Minister to put as much information about the funding processes for unavoidably small hospitals in the public domain. We were talking just prior to the debate, and she said that some of this information rests with the new ICBs, which is fair enough. That may well be the case, but they're not elected bodies. We know that the NHS can be rather top-down and bureaucratic in some of its behaviours, and the more information I think the Minister can put into the public domain to help us understand members with unavoidably small hospitals, the better. Before I do that, I'd like to put on record my thanks to staff, not only at St Mary's, but also GPs on the Isle of Wight and their staff, the pharmacists, the dentists, and all the staff in care homes who do a no less valuable job. And I know that some of the problems we are facing is because of a lack of integration into our adult social care system, looking after the elderly and vulnerable, and not being able to find a home for them, which then puts additional pressure on hospitals. I also want to put on record my thanks to the government for the 48 million capital additional spending on the island. Indeed, the former Chancellor, I suspect, deserves thanks for that, as well as also thanks for the fair funding formula reference for the Isle of Wight. I'm incredibly delighted that he did both of those, and very grateful. And for me, that 48 million is part of getting a better deal for the island, which clearly is an ongoing project and continues. In England and Wales, there are 12 unavoidably small hospitals, which are defined as hospitals due to location and population served and distance from alternative hospitals as being unavoidably smaller than the normal, quotes, unquote, size of a district general hospital. On the Isle of Wight's case, we are about half the size, about 55 to 60% of that population needed for a district general hospital. The pressures on these small hospitals are greater, I would argue, Mr. Chairman, than elsewhere. They're smaller, so they're more easily overwhelmed due to their size. They're under greater economic pressure because the NHS funding model, and we clearly recognise there has to be a funding model, the funding model is clearly designed for an average-sized, a quotes, unquote, normal district general hospital rather than an undersized one. So on the island, you can't give birth on a helicopter. You can't give birth on a ferry. We need to run our maternity. We need to run A&E 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. But our income is based on national tariffs that do not equate to the size of our population. And as the Islands Trust says, the island's population is around half of that normally needed to sustain a district general hospital. And the third point, the third pressure on unavoidably small hospitals, Mr. Chairman, I would suggest is because they exist outside major population centres. Frankly, in some of those lovely parts of the United Kingdom, England and Wales, without a shadow of doubt. But because they're outside those major population centres, recruitment and retention of staff becomes more difficult, which adds pressure on those staff who are there, but also adds costs in terms of locums, in terms of agency staff, which can have a highly significant effect on budgets. And the pressures reflected in St Mary's on the Isle of Wight, ferries aside, with the partial exception of the Scilly Isles, these are shared by other unavoidably small hospitals. And I think that helps to explain why a number of unavoidably small hospitals have in the last decade have issues around being put in special measures or have sadly failed despite the best efforts of those people who work there in other ways. Our hospital, St Mary's, is classed as 100% remote, unique even by unavoidably small hospital standards, because it's accessible only by ferry. Although I note that accessibility by sea is not normally a factor, or not a factor as far as I can see in the definition of an unavoidably small hospital. And yet on the island, our need for healthcare is arguably higher than the United Kingdom. So we struggle to get that national standard, but our need for that national standard is greater, because over a quarter of our resident population is over age 65, and by 2028, that is going to be over 65s, will be 1/3 of the population, and indeed we have a particularly large cohort of 80 to 84-year-olds, and we know all the evidence and common sense suggests that that has a disproportionate effect on healthcare, that older people need healthcare more than young, and especially the very old and the very frail. And so yet we are struggling on the island and potentially in other USH areas to provide that quality for that ageing population. In addition, for the island, because our population doubles over summer, because we have lots of lovely visitors, that impacts on demand. So our A&E can be close to overflowing at times, even as efficiently run as it is. And there's also an additional factor. I would suggest that the impact on high levels of social isolation linked to people retiring to the island as a couple, one sadly dies, and leaving the other isolated from family and social networks because their lives have been in other parts of the United Kingdom. But that leads to increased reliance on statutory services. All this has been noted, Mr Chairman. The former Health Secretary, the Right Honourable Member for West Suffolk, confirmed his concerns to me in July 2019, telling the House, on island healthcare costs, the Isle of Wight is unique in terms of its health geography. That was a quote, and quotes, there are places in this country, including the island almost certainly, where healthcare costs are increased. Now, I'm not saying that we're the only place, because you can have isolation in other parts, in Yorkshire, in Cornwall, in Devon, in Cumbria, but in the island's case, it is cut and dried because our separation by sea from the mainland. In the Islands NHS Trust, in its January 2019 sustainability plan, estimated that the annual costs of providing a similar, and this is the critical element I would stress with ministers, a similar level of healthcare on the island as enjoyed by mainland residents, to have that similar standard, we would have to spend an additional £9 million, and this is 2019 figures, an additional £9 million to provide 24/7 acute services, including maternity, including A&E. For providing additional ambulance services, including Coast Guard helicopter ambulance, was about £1.5 million, and then patient travel, which is funded in the Scilly Isles out of the CCC budget, now the ICB. Ours is not. And that patient travel budget comes from ferry discounts and council contributions, and that was estimated to be £560,000. So all in total, one is looking at between 10 and 12 million at 2019 figures. Now, either because it was going to do so anyway, or hopefully because of representations from myself and others, the government has since then recognised that unavoidably small hospitals need a funding model which serves them, because there is no alternative but to keep those hospitals open to serve those populations in a way which is ethical and frankly legal nowadays. I'm proud of our efforts to highlight unavoidably small hospitals and the plight of unavoidably small hospitals to the government, and I thank the government for listening and to try to put in place a package of support for unavoidably small hospitals. And this is where I would really welcome from the Minister more facts being put into the public domain, because trawling through NHS documents for the last couple of days, the last figure I can see about the unavoidably small hospital uplift for St Mary's on the Isle of Wight was the 2019 figure, where we received 5.3 million. Now, that is roughly half what we think we need to run a national level service. So we're very grateful that the government has recognised the need for an uplift to unavoidably small hospitals, but can the Minister please update me as to how much money St Mary's has had as an unavoidably small hospital since 2019, given clearly that we've had issues with COVID. That figure, by the way, the money was given due to, quotes, higher costs over and above those covered by market force factors. And that's page 13, NHS Technical Kind Allocation Formulae and Pace of Change 2019. As I say, I can't see other figures in the public domain. I also don't quite understand how the government has calculated that figure in 2019, saying it could calculate that figure when the advisory committee in January 2019 said that it was, quotes, unable to find evidence of unavoidable costs faced in remote areas that are quantifiable and nationally consistent, such that they could be factored into allocations. That was from NHS England document note on CCG allocations 2019 to 2020 to 23 to 24. So the government is saying we can't work out how much extra to give unavoidably small hospitals, whilst at the same time, a different NHS document is saying, well, we are going to do some calculations and here's the rough calculation. So can the government work out unavoidably small the additional costs, or can it not? Because it is basically saying the same thing in two separate documents. Yes.
I'm very grateful. I congratulate him on bringing forward this very important debate. Can I give him an example of how the government might calculate this? Yes. Because in my constituency, we have a hospital at Scarborough that is actually run by the York NHS Foundation Trust. And they tell me that they have to pay extra to get consultants to travel to Scarborough, to stay overnight, and pay them extra to stay as well as paying their hotel bills. Yeah. However we factor this stuff in, we've got to be able to make a calculation that allows those trusts to properly fund these hospitals.
Thank you very much. I thank my honourable friend for that. Very valuable intervention. And for me, we have exactly the same problem, and I'll come on to how we're trying to solve it, but we have the same issue getting consultants over from Portsmouth. And although we're very close to Portsmouth and indeed Southampton, because of the size of if you are a consultant with a speciality, it is very difficult to be working in a small NHS trust because you simply don't have the opportunity to practice your speciality enough effectively to keep your ticket to do your very valuable and worthwhile job. So whilst I'm grateful for the additional costs and delighted that the previous Conservative government has recognised additional costs and indeed given us near 50 million of additional capital expenditure on the Isle of Wight, the research by my own trust assessed that the funds given are roughly half of what is needed. Now, I stress that we are not on the island, we're not just sitting there saying we want money. We understand that we need to sort these problems out for ourselves. So what we're trying to do, and our trust was in special measures. It is now rated good, and that is because of some fantastic hard work by Maggie Oldham and other health leaders who have come in and frankly turned our hospital around and really helped to make a difference. And again, I thank everybody from the cleaning staff through to the most junior nurse to the most junior doctor for the great work that they have done in that. So we're now rated good. So we have been looking at ways to provide better services on the island without just waiting for the government to provide funding. So we are integrating. We have deepened our relationship with Portsmouth General Hospital, so when they hire, which is our university hospital, so when they hire a consultant, the idea being is that we will then share that consultant for 10% or 25% of their time. So if you have a world-leading consultant in some medical expertise, some of that time will be spent looking after folks on the Isle of Wight. We have reformed our mental health services, and we are reforming our ambulance service as well to make sure that we have more ambulances out there to treat more people more quickly. Secondly, along with everywhere else, we are now integrating adult social care as part of the government's plans. And again, we want to be pioneers in this because of our age demographic. The more that we can be in the front of the queue, and I've learnt sadly, if the island isn't first, it tends to be last because it comes to be an afterthought. So I always want to make sure that my island gets into the front of the queue so that when the government is looking to test pilot schemes, it comes to us first. And thirdly, we are looking at those chances to pilot new schemes. So we did it with Test and Trace. We are adopting telemedicine as fast as we can. We're working with Southampton University to pilot drones. flying over to deliver cancer care. And indeed, actually, the drone testing, the flying the pilotless drones, started off during COVID, and as of a couple of months ago, it is now a regular service that brings over just-in-time cancer medicine to the Isle of Wight, which is a really good way to see that, you know, advanced technology is helping folks on the island and indeed helping the NHS provide better quality service. I'm just going to round up. I'm mindful that other people want to speak on this, and it's important that the Minister hears other voices as well on this. The NHS long-term plan, January 2019, set out a 10-year strategy for the NHS in England. On smaller acute hospitals, such as St Mary's, the plan stated that the NHS would develop a standard model of delivery. It would be great to hear from the Minister what has happened to that plan of a standard model of delivery. Is that now the funding formula which is included in the new integrated care boards? If so, can the Minister please outline, as myself and honourable friend have asked, how that funding formula works and is calculated? Because I think it is in the public interest that that formula be as transparent as possible. Will the Minister please explain to me why the Scilly Isles, if you travel from the Scilly Isles to the mainland for care, you are, and you know, well done folks on the Scilly Isles, that is paid for out of a central budget, when if you travel, if you've got prostate cancer or other forms of specialised cancer, very often that you need to be treated in either Portsmouth or occasionally in Southampton, that funding does not come from government. So why is that? Why is there a double standard which affects the Isle of Wight negatively? And finally, she mentioned before the debate when she was chatting that the funding formula details are held at an ICB level, the new integrated care boards. I do think it's worthwhile for the 20 members of Parliament in England and Wales who have or are within the remit of an unavoidably small hospital, that those figures are not held at an ICB level but are shared from ministers to interested members, so that we can all see how these very, very important institutions in our communities are funded. And by doing so, I hope that we can increase the funding for them, or at least increase government's understanding that these hospitals, just because they are the smaller cousins of larger district general hospitals, should not be treated worse, but indeed should be given that extra care and attention to make sure that our folks in our communities can have the same standard of care as other people in throughout the rest of England and Wales. And I'll leave it there, so thank you very much indeed.